The church was cold. Lynn felt the chill through the thin silk of her red cheongsam, a color for joy that felt like a mockery. People said a wedding was a happy day. People said a husband was a protector. The people who said these things were the same ones who had sold her, their words as hollow as the promises they made. The man beside her was a stranger, tall and silent. Owen, they called him, a rancher. He smelled of pine and cold air, a scent as foreign as the flat, snow-covered land stretching outside the church doors. The preacher's words were a meaningless drone. She understood only a fraction of them, but she understood the finality. She understood the looks from the townspeople in the pews, pity from some, contempt from most. They saw a fragile doll, an exotic trinket bought and paid for. They waited for her to break. She would not give them the satisfaction. When it was over, he placed a heavy coat over her shoulders. The wool was rough against her neck, but it was warm. He did not touch her otherwise. He simply stood, a bulwark against the curious stares, and waited for her to move first. This was the first surprise. She had braced herself for a hand on her arm, a possessive grip to drag her into her new life. Instead, he offered only silent presence. He walked out of the church, and after a moment's hesitation, she followed. The snow crunched under her thin slippers. The wind was sharp, pulling at the intricate knots in her hair. He walked ahead, his long strides eating up the distance, yet he always seemed to maintain the same space between them. 10 paces. Not so far that she would be lost, but far enough that she felt utterly alone. She expected cruelty. She expected a master's hand and a servant's life. That was the transaction. What she did not expect was this profound, unnerving silence, this deliberate distance. He was a wall she could not read, a winter sky with no sun. Every step toward his remote homestead was a step deeper into a future she could not predict, a future defined by a man who refused to claim her. If you have ever felt trapped, not by chains, but by the silent expectations of others, then you know the weight of this walk. If you understand what it means to search for a threat and find only emptiness, you are welcome here. Subscribe for more stories that find strength in the quietest places. He stopped at the door of a small, severe-looking house. It was made of dark wood, stark against the endless white of the snow. A single plume of gray smoke rose from a stone chimney, the only sign of life for miles. He unlocked the door and pushed it open, stepping aside to let her enter first. Another surprise. The gesture was one of courtesy, an act so small and so unexpected it sent a tremor of confusion through her. She stepped over the threshold into a single large room. It was sparse, clean, and warm. A fire crackled in the hearth. A simple wooden table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A kitchen area was tucked into one corner. There was a door leading off to what she assumed was his bedroom. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the moment the quiet would break, the moment the reality of her situation would crash down upon her. He followed her in, closing the door and shutting out the whining wind. The silence that filled the room was different now, thicker, more intimate. He took off his hat and coat, hanging them on a peg by the door. He did not look at her. His movements were economical, deliberate. He walked to the other door, the one she dreaded, and opened it. He gestured inside. "This is your room," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was the first time he had spoken to her directly since the church. Lynn stared at him, then at the doorway. A room. Her own room. Inside, a narrow bed was neatly made with a thick quilt. There was a small washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single wooden chest at the foot of the bed. It was a cell, perhaps, but it was a private one. The lock was on the inside. He had not followed her to the doorway. He had remained by the fire, his back to her, giving her space to process this offering. It was not kindness, she told herself. It was a practical arrangement, an owner setting boundaries for his new possession. Yet it felt like something else. It felt like a choice. He had given her a lock. She went inside and closed the door, her hand resting on the cool metal of the latch. She did not turn it, not yet. She listened, waiting for his footsteps, for the turn of the handle, but there was nothing. Only the crackle of the fire and the muffled sound of him moving about in the main room. Later, a soft knock came. She flinched. "Food," he said through the wood. She waited until the sound of his footsteps receded before she opened the door. A bowl of simple stew and a piece of bread sat on the floor. He was nowhere to be seen. She took the food back into her room and ate, the warmth spreading through her cold body. It was plain food, but it was hot. It was sustenance. It was another gesture she could not decipher. He was feeding her as one would feed a timid animal, trying to coax it into trust. She ate, and she waited. The night deepened, and the house fell into a profound stillness. She finally slid the bolt on her door, the sound echoing in the quiet. It was the first choice she had made all day. The first days fell into a silent rhythm. Owen rose before the sun, the quiet scrape of his boots on the floorboards the only alarm she needed. He would tend to the fire, and by the time Lynn emerged from her room, a pot of coffee would be warming on the hearth, and a portion of bread or oatmeal would be on the table. He would already be gone, out into the biting cold to tend to his livestock. She would see him from her window, a solitary figure moving against the vast white landscape. He was a man made of winter, stark, quiet, and enduring. The house was her world. It was small, but it was a fortress. Here there were no staring eyes, no whispered insults. There was only the steady ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece and the sigh of the wind outside. She learned the sounds of the house, the groan of the wood as it settled, the hiss of melting snow dripping from the eaves, the way the floorboards creaked differently under his weight than hers. She did not have tasks. He asked nothing of her. The first day she had stayed in her room, a prisoner by choice. The second she ventured out, tidying the few dishes from her morning meal, wiping down the table. She half expected him to return and reprimand her for touching his things, but when he came in at dusk, stamping the snow from his boots, he merely glanced at the clean table and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That was it. That was their communication, a silent acknowledgement of a shared space. He would eat his dinner on one side of the table, she on the other. The silence between them was a living thing, a wide, empty plain they both navigated with caution. She watched him. She noted the calluses on his hands, the weariness in his shoulders at the end of the day. He was not a cruel man. He was not a kind man. He simply was. He existed, and he allowed her to exist beside him. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, she found a stack of old newspapers on a low shelf. The English words were a jumble of unfamiliar shapes, but she looked at the pictures, tracing the lines of drawings of faraway cities and strange machines. She was carefully folding one when he entered, earlier than usual. She froze, the paper crinkling in her hands, certain she would be punished for her curiosity. He stopped, his gaze falling on the paper. He looked at her, then at the stack. "You can read them," he said. His voice, still so unfamiliar, startled her. He walked to the fire and began to warm his hands, his back to her once more. Permission. He had given her permission. It was another small, bewildering chip in the wall of her fear. She was his wife. People said a wife belonged to her husband. Her things were his things. Her body was his thing. But this man, her husband, gave her a room with a lock, left food at her door, and told her she could read his papers. He was following a set of rules she did not understand, and it was more terrifying than any cruelty she had imagined. The trip to town was unavoidable. Supplies were low and a storm was predicted. The thought of facing those people again made Lynn's stomach clench. The memory of their stares was a physical weight. When Owen hitched the horses to the sleigh, his movements were as deliberate as always. He did not ask her to come. He stated it as a fact. "We are going to town." He laid a heavy blanket on the seat for her. The silence on the ride was different from the silence in the house. It was thin, fragile, easily broken by the imagined sound of whispers. The town looked just as she remembered, a handful of wooden buildings huddled together against the cold, leaking smoke and judgment. As they walked toward the general store, the whispers began. They were real this time. A woman pulled her child closer, as if Lynn were a disease. A group of men standing outside the saloon stopped talking and watched them pass, their eyes lingering on the vibrant red of her dress, which she wore under her heavy coat like a secret armor. Owen seemed oblivious, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of sawdust, coffee, and prejudice. The storekeeper, a portly man with a stained apron, gave Owen a familiar nod, but his eyes slid to Lynn, slick with a greasy curiosity. Owen began listing his needs in his low, steady voice. Flour, salt, coffee, kerosene. As he spoke, two women near the fabric bolts began to whisper loudly. "Barely a woman," one said, her voice sharp. "Paid a pretty penny for that one, I hear. Wonder if she's worth it." Lynn's blood ran cold. She stared down at her hands, her knuckles white where she gripped the folds of her dress. She wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. This was the humiliation she had been dreading. Owen stopped speaking. The entire store went quiet. The storekeeper froze, a sack of beans halfway to the counter. Lynn held her breath. She expected shouting. She expected him to defend his honor, his purchase. Instead, he slowly turned his head and looked at the two women. He did not glare. He did not threaten. He simply looked at them, his gray eyes as flat and cold as a frozen lake. He held their gaze until they flushed and looked away, suddenly fascinated by a display of buttons. Then he turned back to the storekeeper. "And 2 pounds of sugar," he said, his voice unchanged. That was it. No explosion, no violence, just a quiet, unyielding gravity that bent the room to his will. He had not defended her. He had dismissed them. He had rendered their venom irrelevant. He paid for the supplies, gathered the sacks, and walked out. She followed, her steps unsteady. He had shielded her, not by standing in front of her, but by creating a space where their words could not reach. He did not own her. He simply included her in his formidable silence. The ride back to the ranch was heavy with the unspoken events of the town. Lynn sat wrapped in the blanket, the cold outside a welcome distraction from the turmoil inside. She replayed the scene in the store over and over. The women's sharp words, the sudden crushing silence. Owen's quiet, dismissive gaze. He had not been shamed by her, nor had he been shamed by their talk. He had simply refused to participate. It was a form of power she had never witnessed before. Not the power of fist or money, but the power of absolute self-possession. He did not care what they thought. And in that moment, by standing next to him, neither did she. When they arrived back at the house, they unloaded the supplies in their usual efficient silence. But something had shifted. The air between them was different. The silence was no longer an empty space, but a shared territory they had defended together. A fragile truce had been forged in the face of a common enemy. That evening she made a choice. Instead of taking her plate to her room, she sat at the table. She did not look at him, but she did not hide. She ate across from him, the width of the wooden table a vast but traversable distance. He acknowledged her presence with a slight dip of his head, and they ate. The rhythmic sound of their forks against the ceramic plates was the only conversation. The next day she rose early, before he did. She crept out into the main room, the floorboards cold beneath her feet. She stoked the embers of the fire, coaxing them back to life, and put the coffee pot on to boil. It was a small thing, a simple task, but it was an offering. When he emerged from his room, he stopped in the doorway, seeing her there by the hearth. The firelight cast flickering shadows on her face. For a long moment, he just watched her. She expected him to be angry, to see it as an intrusion on his routine. She braced herself, her hands tightening on the handle of the pot. He walked past her to the pegs by the door and pulled on his boots. As he was about to leave, he paused. "The coffee is good," he said, without turning around. And then he was gone, out into the pale morning light. The words hung in the air, simple and unadorned. It was not praise, it was a statement of fact. But to Lynn, it felt like a conversation. It was the first brick laid in the foundation of a strange new trust. The world outside was still cruel and cold, but inside this small wooden house, a quiet warmth was beginning to grow, tended by two silent people who were learning a language that had no words. If you've ever found courage not in a loud declaration, but in a quiet, deliberate action, this space is for you. If you believe that trust is built in silent moments of mutual respect, then subscribe and join our community. We have more stories to share. The deep cold of midwinter settled over the ranch, locking the world in ice. One morning, Lynn woke to a different kind of silence. The steady tick of the clock was gone. The house felt colder than usual. When she entered the main room, she saw Owen standing by the hearth, staring at the dead, gray ashes. A faint, acrid smell hung in the air. "Chimney's blocked," he said. He did not seem angry, just resigned. Ice and soot. He spent the morning on the roof in the biting wind, trying to clear the blockage, his hammer taps echoing dully through the house. Lynn watched from the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. He was a dark shape against a gray sky, relentless and determined. He finally came back inside, covered in a fine layer of snow and soot, his face grim. The blockage was too solid. The fire was unusable, which meant no heat and no way to cook. The temperature in the house was already dropping, a damp chill seeping through the walls. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than stoicism on his face. It was not worry, but a deep, focused concentration. He looked around the room, his eyes assessing their situation. Then he looked at her. "We'll have to board up the fireplace to stop the draft," he said, "and keep the doors closed." His gaze fell on the kitchen stove, a small cast-iron box used for cooking. "That will have to be enough." It was not a large stove. It would provide some warmth, but only if they stayed near it. This was the new reality. The house, their fortress, had shrunk to a small circle of survivable space around the little iron stove. The invisible boundaries they had so carefully maintained were about to be erased. He worked to board up the massive fireplace, and she instinctively began to help. She handed him nails. She held boards steady while he hammered them into place. They did not speak. Their hands brushed once, and she flinched, but his focus was entirely on the task. Her fear was a distant thing, replaced by the immediate, practical need to survive. When the hearth was sealed, a profound gloom fell over the room. The only light came from the windows and a single kerosene lamp. He lit the stove, and the small fire inside seemed fragile against the encroaching cold. They pulled the table and their chairs close to it. There was no more his side and her side. There was only the small island of warmth in a sea of freezing air. That night, she did not retreat to her room. It was as cold as a tomb. She brought the quilt from her bed and wrapped it around her shoulders, huddling in a chair near the stove's faint heat. He sat opposite her, cleaning a piece of equipment, the scrape of metal on leather, a rhythmic sound in the quiet. The proximity was unnerving, but the shared crisis created a strange sort of companionship. They were no longer just a man and a woman in a house. They were two people fighting the same enemy, the cold. She must have drifted off because she woke with a start to find he had draped his own heavy wool coat over her shoulders on top of her quilt. He was sitting in his chair, watching the fire in the stove, his face illuminated by its soft orange glow. He had given her his warmth. Again. The days of the deep freeze blurred together. Their world was the small circle of light and warmth cast by the kitchen stove. They worked around each other in the cramped space, a silent, efficient dance. He would bring in snow to melt for water. She would make coffee and soup. The formal distance between them had been replaced by a practical intimacy. She learned the sound of his breathing in the quiet of the night. He learned that she hummed softly to herself when she thought he wasn't listening. They were two strangers tethered together by a shared struggle against the elements. One afternoon he was mending a piece of harness, his large hands surprisingly deft with the needle and thread. She was kneading dough for bread, a skill her mother had taught her. Her hands were covered in flour. She watched him for a moment, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a man who fixed things. A broken harness, a blocked chimney, a life. Perhaps he was trying to fix her life, too, in his own quiet, methodical way. On his next trip to town, after the weather had cleared enough for safe travel, he came back with the usual supplies. But at the bottom of one of the sacks there was a small, cloth-wrapped parcel. He set it on the table without a word and went outside to tend to the horses. She hesitated, then carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a pair of thick woolen stockings and a pair of sturdy, fleece-lined boots, small enough to fit her. Her thin silk slippers were no match for the brutal cold of this land, a fact he had clearly noted. There was no card, no grand gesture, just a practical solution to a practical problem. But it felt like more. It was an acknowledgement. He saw her. He saw her needs. Her heart, which she had guarded so fiercely, felt a strange, unfamiliar pang. She wanted to give him something in return. It was a need as sharp and sudden as hunger. That night, after he had gone to his room, she took out his work coat, the one he had draped over her during the cold spell. She had noticed a long tear in the sleeve, clumsily mended. She lit a lamp, and with her own small sewing kit she had brought from her old life, she carefully picked out his rough stitches. Using fine, neat movements, she repaired the tear. She matched the thread perfectly. The seam was almost invisible. It was a small act of care, a silent reply to his unspoken kindness. She folded the coat and left it on his chair. The next morning, when he put it on, he paused, his fingers tracing the line of her stitches. He turned and looked at her, a long, searching look. She met his gaze, her heart beating a steady rhythm. He said nothing. He simply nodded, the same small, almost imperceptible gesture as before, but this time it was filled with a meaning that resonated in the quiet room. It was an acceptance, a thank you, a conversation held in thread and wool. The next trip to town felt different. Lynn wore her new boots. They were warm and solid, grounding her. She felt less like a fragile ornament and more like a part of this harsh, unyielding landscape. When they walked into the general store, she did not shrink from the stares. She stood beside Owen, not behind him. The change in her was subtle, but the townspeople noticed. Their whispers were more cautious this time. A man, a loud-mouthed ranch hand from a neighboring spread, saw them standing at the counter. He swaggered over, a smirk on his face. He ignored Lynn, speaking directly to Owen as if she weren't there. "Heard you got yourself a new filly, Owen," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Trained her to heel yet?" The air crackled. The storekeeper stopped polishing the counter. Everyone waited. This was a direct challenge, a crude assertion of power and ownership. Lynn felt a familiar chill of fear, but it was mixed with a new defiant anger. She was not a horse. She was not a thing to be trained. Owen did not tense. He did not raise his voice. He slowly turned to face the man, his expression unreadable. He looked the man up and down, a long, dismissive appraisal. "Her name," Owen said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is Lynn." He paused, letting the statement settle in the silent room. He then turned his head slightly to look at her, a deliberate, inclusive gesture. He was not speaking for her, he was making space for her. He turned back to the ranch hand. "And she is my wife." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. He had not just claimed her, he had defined their relationship on his own terms, in public. The ranch hand, flustered by the calm intensity, tried to recover his swagger. "Well, a wife ought to know her place." Owen took a half step forward. He did not touch the man. He did not need to. His presence was enough. "Her place is her own choice," he said. The finality in his voice was absolute. It was not a threat. It was a law of nature. The ranch hand shuffled his feet, his smirk gone. He mumbled something and retreated to the other side of the store. The moment was over. Owen turned back to the counter as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. He had drawn a line in the sand, not around himself, but around her dignity. He had given her a name and a choice in a world that tried to strip her of both. As they left the store, walking out into the bright, cold sunlight, she felt a profound shift inside her. The fear that had lived in her heart for so long was finally beginning to recede, replaced by a quiet, fierce strength she hadn't known she possessed. If you believe that true strength is not about shouting, but about speaking quiet truths in a loud world, then you have found your people. Subscribe for more stories that honor the power of dignity. The house was no longer a shelter from the world. It had become a world unto itself. The hostile silence of the first weeks had transformed into a comfortable quiet, rich with unspoken understanding. It was a language they had built together, word by word, gesture by gesture. A mended coat, a pair of warm boots, a shared cup of coffee in the pre-dawn dark. Lynn began to claim the space as her own. She started with the food. She found spices in the back of a cupboard, star anise, cinnamon, dried chilies, and began to incorporate them into their simple meals. The bland stews and porridges gave way to dishes that held the faint, fragrant echo of her homeland. She watched him the first time she served a soup laced with ginger and star anise. He ate it slowly, thoughtfully. When he was finished, he looked up from his bowl. "It is good," he said. "Different." It was an opening. She took it. "My mother used to make it," she replied, her voice soft. It was the first time she had volunteered a piece of her past. He nodded, accepting the information without prying for more. The house began to change in other small ways. She cleaned the dusty windows until they shone, letting in more of the winter light. She found a chipped vase and started putting branches of evergreen in it, a touch of stubborn life against the house's austerity. He never commented on these changes, but he never undid them. He observed them, absorbed them into their shared existence. His acceptance was her permission. One evening, a rare celestial event occurred. The sky was clear and black, and the stars were like chips of ice. He came to the door of her room and knocked softly. When she opened it, he was holding her coat. "Come see," he said. She followed him outside into the freezing night. He pointed upward. The sky was filled with faint, shimmering curtains of green and violet light. They danced and swayed, a silent, breathtaking spectacle. They stood side by side, their shoulders almost touching, heads tilted back in shared wonder. "Northern Lights," he said, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. They don't come this far south often." "They are beautiful," she whispered, the words forming a small white cloud in the air. They stood there for a long time, not speaking, simply watching the sky dance. The cold was sharp, but she barely felt it. A warmth bloomed in her chest, a feeling so new and overwhelming she couldn't put a name to it. It was more than safety. It was more than trust. It was the quiet, profound joy of sharing a moment of beauty with another person. It was the feeling of being home. The Chinook winds came at last, a warm breath from the mountains that began to devour the snow. The world, which had been frozen in black and white, slowly began to reveal its colors. Patches of brown earth appeared on the hillsides. The creek at the edge of the property began to flow again, its gurgling sound a welcome disruption of the winter silence. The change in the season mirrored the change in the house. The ice had broken. One afternoon, Owen came in from his work, his face flushed from the warmer air. He was tracking mud on the floor, something he was usually meticulous about avoiding. He seemed distracted, his thoughts elsewhere. Lynn had just made tea. Without thinking, she poured a second cup and held it out to him. He stopped and looked at the cup, then at her. He took it from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. This time she did not pull away. He drank the tea, his eyes never leaving her face. The silence stretched, but it was a different kind of silence. It was not empty. It was full of everything that had passed between them. The fear, the respect, the shared hardship, the quiet acts of care. It was the silence of a story that had been written without words. "Lynn," he said. He spoke her name not as a label, but as if he were truly seeing her for the first time. The person, not the wife. The woman, not the bargain. And in his eyes she saw it, a flicker of something vulnerable, something deeply human. It was the quiet hope of a man who had been alone for a very long time. She met his gaze, and for the first time since she had arrived in this cold, foreign land, she was not afraid. The red dress, her armor, and her cage no longer felt like a costume. It was just a color. The future was no longer a terrifying unknown. It was a path, and for the first time, she felt willing to walk it. The ranch was not a prison. The man before her was not her owner. He was her husband, and the house, once a symbol of her captivity, had finally, improbably, become her home. The story was not over. It was just beginning. If you have ever found a home where you least expected it, or a family in a single, quiet soul, then this story is for you. If you believe that love is not about grand declarations, but about the patient, steady building of a safe place to be yourself, subscribe. There is always a seat by the fire for you here.